Everything we think we know about the beginning of humanity feels stable only because we stand on the surface. We live in the thinnest layer of the story, the part that sunlight can reach. But beneath that surface, under ocean sediment and desert stone, under mountain roots and polar ice, there are older pages. Pages that do not rot. Pages that do not burn. Pages that wait. And lately, those pages have begun to turn themselves, as if a buried hand has started flipping forward, slowly, patiently, toward the chapter we are living right now. The unsettling possibility is not merely that civilizations existed before ours. The unsettling possibility is that they did not just collapse, they were erased, cleanly, repeatedly. And the first 6, if they truly were erased, may have done the only thing they could do for the 7th. They may have left a signal where nothing else could reach it, beneath the ice. In the world of official timelines, history is a ladder. We climb from primitive to complex, from scattered stone tools to cities, from fires in caves to lights in orbit. But the ladder model depends on one quiet assumption, that the rungs below us were not broken, that the steps we cannot see never existed. Yet real evidence does not behave like a ladder. It behaves like a shoreline after a storm. It is jagged, it is scattered, and it leaves strange things in places they should never be. A tool sealed in rock, a geometry repeating across oceans, a star alignment that only makes sense in a sky that no longer exists. At first, these anomalies feel like curiosities, a fringe footnote, a museum rumour, a sonar scan nobody wants to interpret out loud. But then, the anomalies start agreeing with each other. They begin to rhyme. They appear in patterns that are too disciplined to be chance. And once a pattern forms, the human mind does what it always does in the dark. It leans closer. The first whisper of the ice signal did not come from an ancient temple or a drowned city. It came from a place that rarely appears in bedtime stories. A sterile operations room, dimly lit, filled with monitors that show the Earth as data. A research team studying subtle shifts in gravitational fields noticed something that should not have been there. A mass anomaly beneath Antarctica, deep beneath the ice sheet, too dense to be explained by known geology in that region. At first it was filed as instrumentation drift, then as a modelling error, then as a curiosity reserved for later. But later arrived quickly, because a second team working independently on magnetic readings found a disturbance that bent local lines in a way that looked almost shaped. Not the chaotic swirl of mineral deposits, not the broad variation of tectonics, something more like a footprint, something with edges. When you hear Antarctica, you imagine silence, wind that scours, white horizons that erase distance, a place too clean, too empty to hold secrets. But the ice is not emptiness. The ice is storage. It preserves what the world forgets. It compresses time into layers like pages pressed into a single book. And if a civilization wanted to hide something where floods could not reach it, where jungles could not devour it, where war could not loot it, there is no safer vault than a continent of ice. Antarctica is not just remote, it is armoured. It is a fortress made of cold. The rumour spread the way forbidden ideas always spread. Quietly, sideways, through private messages and careful phrasing. A structured anomaly, a non-random signature, a signal-like periodicity that appeared in multiple data sets when the noise was stripped away. Not a radio transmission, not a clear beep-beep message that a child could point to, something subtler, a repeating pulse in the low-frequency domain, so slow it felt like breathing. A rhythm that rose and fell over hours, then repeated. A rhythm that did not match known natural cycles in that location. And as the teams compared timestamps, they noticed something that made the room feel smaller. The pulse intensified during periods of increased geomagnetic activity. When the sky above Earth stirred with charged particles, the buried signal beneath the ice seemed to answer. Not loudly, not aggressively. Like a sleeping thing shifting in response to a distant sound. If this were only a modern mystery, it would be fascinating enough. But the deeper the researchers dug into older records, into archived expedition logs, into declassified anomalies, into forgotten datasets from decades past, the more they realized the ice signal was not new. It had been noticed before, and every time it was noticed, the record ended the same way. The trail went cold, Files were moved, notes were relabeled, projects were restructured, the language changed, the bureaucracies changed, the hardware changed. But the silence after discovery remained constant, like a rule. That is the first reason the signal matters, not because it proves anything by itself, but because it fits a pattern that appears everywhere in the story of the first 6. Whenever evidence points too clearly toward a world before ours, the evidence does not simply become controversial. It becomes unavailable, not debated, removed. The second reason the signal matters is older, much older. Because across human cultures, there is a strange and persistent memory of the South. Not the South as a compass direction, but the South as a place of origin, of hidden knowledge, of a white land where the sky behaves differently and time feels wrong. In some myth traditions, the world begins in a cold place. In others, wisdom is kept in a far southern realm, guarded by distance and storm. For centuries, these stories were interpreted symbolically. But symbols sometimes begin as coordinates, and coordinates sometimes become legends when the map is destroyed. To understand why the first 6 civilizations might hide a signal under ice, we have to step away from the modern obsession with single events and return to the older, slower terror of cycles. The Earth is not a static stage. It is a machine with rhythms. Ocean currents shift, volcanic pressure builds, the magnetic field weakens and wanders. The planet tilts and wobbles in long astronomical patterns that change the distribution of sunlight across millennia. Most societies do not last long enough to notice. They experience weather, not climate cycles. They experience seasons, not deep time. But if 6 civilizations truly rose before ours, then at least one of them might have survived long enough to see the rhythm, long enough to realize that collapse was not always random, long enough to measure the warning signs. In the geological record, there are moments of abrupt change that still haunt scientists. Rapid warming, sudden cooling, ocean-level pulses that redraw coastlines, layers of ash that mark violent winters, strange spikes in isotopes that hint at cosmic events. Whether you interpret these as impacts, eruptions, or chain reactions within Earth systems, the important part is their abruptness. The world does not always change politely. Sometimes it flips. Sometimes it crosses a threshold and becomes a different world in the span of a human lifetime. And when that happens, civilizations do not decline. They vanish. Now imagine being a society that understands this, a society that has watched the world end once, and then again, a society that has rebuilt from survivors who carried only fragments. If you lived through the fall of a previous world, you would stop thinking of monuments as vanity. You would start thinking of them as instructions. You would stop building only upward. You would start building to endure. You would carve messages into stone because paper dissolves. You would align structures to stars because stars are clocks. And if you discovered that the next collapse might involve water, fire, darkness, ice, some convergence of planetary forces, you would ask a question that modern humanity rarely asks until it is too late. Where can we put a warning so the warning survives? Most places fail that test. Cities burn, libraries flood, mountains crack, coastlines drown. But ice preserves, ice seals, ice forgets nothing, it only hides. And Antarctica, for most of human existence, has been unreachable. A safe place to store a message for a future civilization that finally develops the means to return. So the new overarching theme of our story is not simply 6 civilizations erased. It is this. What if the first 6 did not only leave ruins? What if they left a system, a device, a slow, patient beacon designed to wake only when the cycle begins again? Not a radio broadcast, but a planetary alarm clock. Something that listens to the Earth's field, to the sky's activity, to the subtle trembling of the planet, and then answers with a pulse, a reminder that the 7th civilization has reached the same edge. The most unsettling detail about the ice signal is how it behaves when researchers try to approach it. Early proposals to map the anomaly more aggressively faced sudden barriers that sounded ordinary on paper. Weather complications, funding changes, environmental concerns, equipment rerouting. Yet even when teams managed to get closer with remote sensing, the signal seemed to change, not disappear, shift, like a candle flame responding to a hand moving near it. The frequency drifted slightly. The intensity dipped, then returned. It was never a clean, easy measurement. It was always evasive. Here is where the narrative becomes eerie. Not because we are claiming a monster under the ice, but because we are confronting the possibility of design. Natural phenomena are messy. They produce noise. They fluctuate without seeming to care whether we are watching. Designed phenomena, even when degraded by time, often retain one haunting trait: intentionality. Patterns that look like decisions, responses that look like behaviour. And behaviour is what the ice signal resembles when it reacts to external conditions. At the same time, history demands caution. Antarctica has secrets that are purely geological: subglacial lakes, ancient mountain ranges buried under ice, odd mineral concentrations that distort readings. A historian's job is not to convert mystery into certainty, but to place it in context. And context matters here because the idea of a signal from a prior civilization sits at the border between speculation and evidence. So we do what careful storytellers do. We hold both audiences in the same hand. For the part of you that wants the eerie narrative, we let the buried signal feel like a heartbeat in the dark. For the part of you that wants historical grounding, we remind ourselves that humans have repeatedly built long-term messages for unknown futures: time capsules, inscriptions, warning markers, monuments designed to outlast empires. The concept is not alien to history. Only the timescale is, and the timescale is the point, because if there were 6 civilizations before ours, they would not all need to be global in the modern sense. They could be networks of high capability concentrated in regions that later drowned or dried. They could rise during periods of stable climate and fall during abrupt transitions. Survivors could carry fragments into the next era, building new cultures on top of old foundations. That model, collapse, survival, rebuilding, fits what we already know about human resilience across known historical cataclysms. The leap is simply extending the pattern further back than our current textbooks allow. Now return to the ice. A hidden signal, buried and pulsing, suggests one more leap: coordination. The first 6 civilizations, if they existed, may have recognized that memory is the first casualty of collapse. Not death, not hunger. Memory, the continuity of knowledge, the ability to say, "This happened before, and it will happen again." Without memory, each civilization believes it is the first. And believing you are the first makes you careless in exactly the ways that doom you. So they leave a signal not to prove they existed, but to prevent us from forgetting the pattern the moment we need it most. The third reason the ice signal matters is what it does to the rest of the puzzle. Once you allow the possibility of a preserved system under Antarctica, many scattered ideas begin to arrange themselves. The repeating global geometries in ancient construction start to resemble a network rather than coincidences. The obsession with astronomical alignment begins to look like timing rather than worship. The myths of floods and firestorms begin to read like compressed survival records, and the strange modern feeling that something is shifting begins to sound less like paranoia and more like an inherited instinct responding to real environmental cues. People often describe these stories as fear, but their power, especially in a sleep-friendly telling, comes from a quieter emotion: recognition. A sense of having heard this before, a sense of walking into a room you have never entered and still knowing where the door is. That feeling is exactly what the example script cultivates, this soft dread wrapped in familiarity. And the ice signal fits perfectly into that emotional architecture, because it suggests the past is not silent, it is waiting, listening, and now, perhaps, speaking. Imagine the 6th civilization at its height. Not in the cartoon way of shining towers, but in the practical way real civilizations peak. Stable agriculture, long-distance navigation, engineering traditions refined over centuries, institutions capable of coordinating projects that outlast single rulers. Imagine them watching the sky, measuring solar cycles, tracking magnetic drift through aurora behavior and compass anomalies, noticing changes in animal migration, in ocean patterns, in the taste of air before storms. Their scientists may not have used our words, but they could still have done the work. They could still have charted the world's long breath. Then the warning signs return, the same signs that appear in our data now: magnetic instability, ocean current shifts, increased volcanic restlessness, climate volatility. They realize the cycle is nearing a turning point. They know they cannot save everything. They know they may not even save themselves. So they do the only thing that makes sense when your world is about to be erased. They choose what can survive and they build for that. They build monuments that last. They encode knowledge in myth so it can travel without libraries. They teach geometry as ritual so it persists in hands even when theories die. And then perhaps they build something else, something small in concept, immense in consequence, a beacon that can wait through the silence, not a message that demands to be decoded, a message that simply says, "You are not the first, and the reason you are not the first is still here." This is where the fourth reason emerges, and it is the most haunting for the seventh civilization, because a signal implies timing. A beacon implies it is meant to activate at a specific phase, and if the buried pulse grows stronger during geomagnetic agitation, it may mean the device, if it is a device, was designed to react when Earth's protective field weakens, when cosmic radiation increases, when the sky begins to behave like it did before previous collapses. In other words, it is not only a memory of the past, it is an alarm for the present. For the historical mind, this is where we slow down and breathe. We acknowledge uncertainty. We remember that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. We remember that Antarctica is a place where data is difficult, and interpretations can be distorted by the complexity of ice, rock, and magnetism. We remember that anomaly does not automatically mean artifact, but we also remember something else that history teaches relentlessly. Institutions often resist stories that threaten their foundation, not always through evil, sometimes through inertia, sometimes through fear of chaos, sometimes through the quiet assumption that certain doors should remain closed because opening them would force the world to rewrite itself. And rewriting the world is exhausting. So the ice signal remains half seen, half whispered, like so many other pieces in this puzzle, yet the puzzle keeps assembling itself anyway. Because the seventh civilization has tools the first six did not. Satellites, deep sensing, models that can simulate climate shifts and magnetic drift. And perhaps most importantly, global communication that allows patterns to be compared across continents before they can be buried. If you're listening to this as you fall asleep, let the idea settle gently rather than sharply. The point is not to panic. The point is to remember that the past may be bigger than we were taught, and that big pasts leave big echoes, under deserts, under oceans, under mountains, under ice. And now, as the seventh civilization reaches deeper into the world, the ice is beginning to answer. The last image to carry with you in this first block is not an explosion, not a flood, not a dramatic collapse. It is quieter. It is the slow pulse beneath Antarctica, repeating like a breath. It is the possibility that 6 erased worlds knew the 7th would come, that they prepared not to save themselves but to save continuity, to save memory, to save the one thing collapse tries to destroy first. Because if we are truly the 7th civilization, then our greatest danger is not that the cycle returns. Our greatest danger is that we meet it as if it were new, and somewhere under the oldest ice on Earth something patient may be trying to prevent exactly that. If the signal beneath the Antarctic ice is real, whether as an engineered system, a preserved structure, or a phenomenon deliberately shaped by intelligence, then it cannot stand alone. No civilization that understands collapse thinks in single points. Collapse does not arrive politely at one door. It comes everywhere at once, through oceans and skies, through food systems and climates, through fear and forgetting. So if the first 6 civilizations truly reached a level where they could anticipate planetary scale resets, then their response would not have been a single monument, a single vault, or a single warning buried in one place. It would have been a network, a distributed memory system stretched across the Earth itself. This is where the myths begin to change character. They stop sounding like isolated stories and start sounding like fragments of a shared map. Across cultures that never officially met, cultures separated by oceans, ice, and thousands of years, we find recurring ideas that are strangely specific. Not just floods, but floods that arrive after a time of imbalance. Not just fire, but fire from the sky. Not just darkness, but a darkness that lasts longer than a normal night. and almost always there is a warning. A group that listens, a group that prepares, a group that survives because they recognize the signs early enough. These stories have long been treated as moral allegories or religious metaphors, but allegories, at their core, are compression algorithms. They reduce complex technical knowledge into narratives that can survive memory loss. From a historical perspective, this is not unusual. We know for certain that ancient societies encoded agricultural calendars into festivals, astronomical observations into gods, and navigational knowledge into song. Polynesian wayfinders memorized star paths as chants. Australian Aboriginal cultures preserved tens of thousands of years of environmental data through oral tradition, describing coastlines that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. These are not myths in the sense of fiction. They are databases written in human emotion. So when we see repeated references to a time before, to earlier worlds destroyed by natural upheaval, the responsible historical question is not, is this literally true? But, what information was important enough to be preserved this way? And when we apply that question globally, a pattern begins to emerge that aligns disturbingly well with the idea of 6 prior civilizations erased not by moral failure, but by planetary cycles. Consider the obsession with stone, not wood, not metal, stone. Massive, precisely shaped stone, placed in locations that seem impractical for simple shelter or defense. From a purely utilitarian perspective, many megalithic structures make no sense. They require enormous effort to build and provide little immediate benefit to daily survival. But from the perspective of long-term signaling, they make perfect sense. Stone lasts, stone remembers. Stone can be aligned, measured, oriented, and revisited thousands of years later, with its meaning partially intact. Now consider where these stones are placed, not randomly, but often at points of geological or astronomical significance, on fault lines, near ancient coastlines, at latitudes where solar and stellar movements behave in distinctive ways. When mapped together, not individually, but as a system, these sites begin to resemble nodes rather than isolated wonders. Nodes in a planetary scale design that uses Earth itself as the medium. This is where the eerie narrative deepens, but it does so without abandoning historical discipline. Because even within mainstream archaeology, there is growing recognition that ancient peoples were far more sophisticated observers of natural cycles than once believed. They tracked solstices with astonishing precision. They understood long lunar cycles. They noticed precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes the background stars over tens of thousands of years. Precession alone requires generational knowledge. No single lifetime can observe it fully. To track it, a culture must value continuity more than novelty. Now imagine a civilization that not only tracks precession, but connects it to climate instability. That notices correlations between stellar positions, solar output, and Earth's behavior. That begins to understand that certain alignments correspond with periods of increased risk. That civilization would not think in centuries, it would think in cycles. And once you think in cycles, history stops being a straight line. It becomes a spiral. This spiral model appears everywhere once you start looking for it. In ancient iconography, in cosmological myths, in symbolic art carved into rock faces that survived floods and fires. The spiral is not just decoration. It is a warning shape, a reminder that what appears to be progress is often a return, but at a different level. The first 6 civilizations may have understood this better than we do, because they may have lived it. From the perspective of the 7th civilization, this raises an uncomfortable possibility, that our sense of uniqueness is the very thing that blinds us. Each prior civilization may have believed it was the first to reach its height. Each may have believed its technology, its understanding, its dominance over nature was unprecedented, and each, at the moment of greatest confidence, may have been closest to collapse, not because of hubris alone, but because the cycle does not care about belief. This is where the idea of erasure becomes more precise. Erasure does not require intention, it requires alignment. When multiple destabilizing forces converge, climate shifts, sea level rise, volcanic winters, magnetic field weakening, cosmic radiation spikes, The result is not a gentle decline. It is a reset. Infrastructure fails. Knowledge networks fragment. Populations scatter. And within a few generations, the memory of the world before becomes myth. But myths, as we've seen, can carry signals. The Antarctic beacon, if it exists, may be only the deepest layer of a much larger system. A final vault, placed where almost nothing could disturb it. But above it, spread across the accessible world, there may be echoes designed to guide future interpreters toward it. Not directions in the modern sense, but recognitions. Familiar shapes, familiar alignments, familiar stories that say, in essence, if you are advanced enough to see this pattern, you are close enough to hear the warning. From a historical standpoint, this is where caution and curiosity must coexist. There is no single artifact that proves this network, no inscription that reads, 6 civilizations came before you. Instead, there is convergence. Multiple independent lines of evidence, archaeological, geological, mythological, astronomical, that all point towards cyclical disruption and deliberate preservation of knowledge. Convergence is how historians build confidence when direct records are gone, and records would be gone if erasure occurred as described. Now consider the role of water. Water is both creator and destroyer of civilizations. It enables agriculture, trade, and settlement. It also erases coastlines, drowns cities, and covers evidence under layers of sediment. Sea levels have risen more than 120 meters since the last glacial maximum. Entire continental shelves, once habitable, fertile land, are now underwater. If advanced societies existed during periods of lower sea level, their coastal hubs would now lie far beneath the waves. From our perspective, it would appear as if civilization began inland, when in fact its earlier chapters are simply submerged. This aligns with a strange bias in the archaeological record, an overrepresentation of inland sites and an underrepresentation of ancient coastal settlements. It is not that early humans avoided coasts, it is that the coasts moved, and with them, history disappeared. The first 6 civilizations may have learned this lesson the hard way. Floods erase faster than fire. So if they wanted to leave something for the future, they would avoid coastlines. They would avoid river deltas. They would avoid places where water and sediment conspire to bury the past. Antarctica, paradoxically, becomes logical again. Locked away from rising seas, isolated from human conflict, preserved by cold rather than destroyed by it. Yet the network would still need surface markers. Not to reveal the signal directly, but to keep the idea alive that something was missing. That history had gaps, that the world had ended before. This may explain why so many ancient sites appear unfinished, repurposed, or culturally disconnected from the people who later inhabit them. A new civilization inherits stone it did not build, stories it does not fully understand, alignments that still work, but whose original purpose has faded. Over time, utility is replaced by ritual. Measurement becomes myth, and eventually myth becomes mere curiosity, until the 7th civilization reaches a point where curiosity turns back into measurement. That point may be now. The modern world is uniquely positioned in this cycle, not because we are morally superior or intellectually enlightened, but because we have global instrumentation. We can measure Earth as a system. We can track magnetic drift in real time. We can model climate feedback loops. We can observe solar behavior with unprecedented precision, and we can communicate patterns instantly across the planet. If the first 6 civilizations left a warning designed to activate when these measurements became possible, then it would not need to shout. It would only need to be detectable. The Antarctic signal, subtle and slow, fits that requirement perfectly. And here is where the eerie narrative quietly tightens its grip. Because if the warning system is designed to activate when certain thresholds are crossed, then the act of detecting it may itself be part of the cycle. Awareness does not stop collapse, but it changes how collapse is met. The first 6 civilizations may not have been trying to save the 7th from disruption. They may have been trying to save continuity itself, the idea that someone, somewhere, would remember what happened and carry that memory forward. History suggests that such memory is fragile. After known collapses, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the abandonment of major Mayan cities, knowledge did not vanish instantly. It thinned, specialized skills were lost, trade routes broke, literacy declined, complex systems simplified, and within a few generations the world felt smaller, harsher, and less connected. Those were minor collapses compared to what planetary-scale resets would look like. If 6 such resets occurred, each one would strip away layers of knowledge until only the most durable forms remained. Stone, story, pattern. This is why writing for sleep and writing for history intersect so naturally in this theme. The story is vast, but it moves slowly. It does not need sharp edges. Its power comes from repetition, from cycles, from the sense of inevitability softened by preparation. Listening to it is like watching waves at night. Each one feels familiar, yet each one reshapes the shore. The final thought to settle into before this block ends is not fear, but responsibility. If we are the 7th civilization, then we are not merely inheritors of a broken past, we are potential ancestors to an 8th. And the question the first 6 may have been asking, through monuments, myths, and buried signals, is not, can you avoid the cycle? It may be simpler and heavier. Can you remember it well enough to warn the next ones? Because if the cycle is real, then survival is not measured by uninterrupted progress. It is measured by whether knowledge crosses the gap intact, and somewhere beneath the ice, something ancient may still be counting the rhythm of the earth, waiting to see if the 7th civilization learns that lesson in time. If civilizations merely collapsed, traces would remain everywhere. Broken cities, gradual decay, layer upon layer of reuse. But what unsettles historians, geologists, and quiet observers alike is not just that evidence of earlier advanced societies is scarce. It is that the scarcity itself appears patterned, clean, selective, as if the past was not only destroyed but edited. This is where the idea of erasure becomes more than poetic language. It becomes a functional concept. Erasure is different from destruction. Destruction leaves debris. Erasure removes context. It strips continuity. It leaves behind fragments that cannot easily be reassembled into a coherent narrative. And when we look at the deep past, that is exactly what we find. Not an absence of anomalies, but an abundance of isolated ones, each dismissed because it does not fit neatly into the accepted sequence. A tool found too deep, a structure dated too early, a map that shows land no longer above water, a myth that describes skies behaving unlike anything in recorded history. Each anomaly alone can be rationalized away. Together they suggest something more deliberate, or at the very least something more systematic. From a historical standpoint, erasure does not require intent. It requires alignment between natural forces and human vulnerability. When certain thresholds are crossed, the world becomes exceptionally good at forgetting. Consider fire. Fire destroys wood, parchment, textiles, and organic matter, the very materials most civilizations use to record knowledge. Stone survives, but stone rarely carries detail. Consider water. Floods rearrange landscapes, bury settlements, and scatter artifacts far from their original context. Consider ice. Ice grinds, ice compresses, ice drags entire regions into geological silence. And consider time itself. Even without catastrophe, time erodes clarity, but catastrophe accelerates the process until memory collapses faster than rebuilding can occur. Now imagine multiple such forces converging. If the first 6 civilizations rose during interglacial periods, times of relative climate stability, they would have flourished along coasts and rivers, just as we have. Trade, agriculture, navigation, and population density all favor water access. But when glacial cycles shift, those same advantages become liabilities. Sea levels rise rapidly, storms intensify, productive land vanishes, and the very centers of civilization are the first to be erased. This is not speculation. It has happened in known history on smaller scales. Entire Bronze Age port cities are now underwater. Roman harbours lie inland, cut off from the sea by sediment. The difference with earlier civilizations is scale and repetition. If 6 global or near-global societies experience these transitions, then each collapse would overwrite the evidence of the one before it. But erasure does not end with nature. Human behavior completes the process. After collapse, survivors prioritize survival, not preservation. Stone is scavenged. Ruins are repurposed. Old structures become quarries. Symbols lose meaning. A perfectly aligned site becomes a convenient foundation. Knowledge that no longer produces immediate benefit is discarded, and within a few generations the world before becomes something the old people talked about. Within a few more it becomes legend. Within a few more it becomes absurd. History, as officially taught, tends to favour continuity because continuity flatters us. It suggests progress is inevitable, that knowledge accumulates, that the present is always wiser than the past. But the deeper record tells a more unsettling story. Knowledge is fragile. It spikes. It collapses. And sometimes it has to be rediscovered from scratch. This reframes the question of the first 6 civilizations entirely. Instead of asking, why don't we see them clearly, we begin to ask, why do we see anything at all? The answer may be that we are seeing exactly what survived erasure, not what was left behind, but what could not be fully destroyed. Stone circles that encode astronomical knowledge without words, myths that describe cosmic events in symbolic language, monuments aligned to stars that no longer occupy the same positions in the sky, global flood stories that agree on sequence even when details differ. These are not records in the modern sense. They are anti-erasure technologies. They are designed to survive ignorance. And this brings us back to the ice. Because ice is not just preservation. Ice is isolation. A message buried beneath kilometers of ice is protected not only from floods and fire, but from reinterpretation, from repurposing, from being misunderstood into uselessness. It waits for a civilization that can reach it without destroying it. That detail matters more than it first appears. Every civilization that rises inherits the ruins of the previous one, but most civilizations treat ruins as raw material, not messages. Stones are moved, symbols are overwritten, meaning is lost even when the structure remains. The first 6 civilizations, if they truly understood erasure, would have known this. They would have known that any warning placed within easy reach would eventually be absorbed, redefined, or neutralized. So they hide the deepest warning where curiosity must mature before access is possible. Antarctica is not just hard to reach physically. It is hard to justify exploring deeply. It is protected by treaties, by logistics, by cost, by danger. Civilization must be globally coordinated, technologically advanced, and relatively stable to even consider sustained deep exploration there. In other words, the warning under the ice is gated. It activates only when the 7th civilization reaches a certain level of capability. This is a familiar concept in history, though usually on much smaller scales. Dangerous knowledge has often been encoded so that only those with prerequisite understanding can access it. Medieval alchemy texts were deliberately obscure. Sacred geometry was hidden in plain sight, visible only to those trained to recognize it. Even modern nuclear launch systems rely on layered access rather than simple locks. The ice signal, if it exists, may represent the ultimate layered warning. Not a message in words, but a presence that can only be noticed by those who are already measuring the planet as a whole, which raises a chilling possibility. What if previous civilizations noticed the signal too late? What if the first 6 built the warning after recognizing the cycle, but could not escape it themselves? What if the system beneath the ice was never meant to save its creators, but only to outlast them? In that case, the silence of history is not a failure. It is the cost of transmission. From the perspective of the 7th civilization, this reframes our role. We are not the protagonists of a linear story. We are a relay, and relays are judged not by how brightly they burn, but by whether they pass the signal forward. At this point in the narrative, the eerie tone does not come from imagining ancient super technologies or lost golden ages. It comes from recognizing a pattern that may be repeating right now. Climate instability, magnetic field weakening, increased cosmic radiation exposure, biodiversity collapse, social fragmentation, information overload paired with wisdom scarcity. These are not signs of imminent apocalypse, but they are signs of transition, of a system under strain. Historically, transitions are when civilizations are most vulnerable to erasure. Not because everything ends at once, but because attention is divided. Resources are stretched. Short-term survival crowds out long-term memory. And in that environment, warnings are easy to ignore, especially if they challenge comforting narratives. This may explain why discussions of deep-time civilization cycles are often met with discomfort rather than curiosity. They threaten not just academic frameworks, but psychological ones. They imply that modernity is not an endpoint, that progress can reverse, that knowledge can be lost, that being advanced does not make one permanent, yet sleep-oriented storytelling thrives on exactly this kind of slow, existential tension. Not panic, but humility. Not fear, but perspective. When the mind relaxes, it becomes more willing to entertain vast timescales, to imagine worlds rising and falling like breaths. And this is where the first 6 civilizations begin to feel less like speculative fantasy, and more like an echo of something we already know at a smaller scale. Every empire believes it is exceptional. Every empire collapses. The only difference here is magnitude. If 6 civilizations existed before ours, then each one likely believed it was standing at the edge of history, looking backward at nothing and forward at everything. And each one was wrong. The 7th civilization, ours, stands in the same place. But there is one difference this time. We are beginning to notice the erasure pattern itself. We are mapping the gaps. We are questioning the silence. We are detecting signals, literal and metaphorical, that something older is still present beneath the surface. And once a civilization becomes aware of erasure, it has a chance, however small, to resist it. Not by stopping collapse entirely. That may be impossible, but by designing memory to survive it. This may be the true legacy of the first 6. Not lost cities or forbidden technologies, but a lesson encoded into the planet. Collapse is not the end. Forgetting is. As this block closes, let the thought soften rather than sharpen. The story is not about doom. It is about continuity, about the quiet courage of civilizations that, facing their own erasure, chose to speak to a future they would never see. If the ice beneath Antarctica truly holds a signal, then it is not accusing us. It is not warning us with urgency. It is waiting with patience. Because patience is the one thing the deep past has in infinite supply. Every civilization leaves traces, not intentionally at first, not as a warning, but as a side effect of simply existing at scale. Roads cut through land, atmospheres change composition, species vanish, new materials appear that nature does not know how to erase quickly. These are not messages in the traditional sense, they're signatures, and long before a civilization decides to preserve itself, it has already begun to record itself into the planet. This is the most unsettling realization of all. Because if the first 6 civilizations left warnings only after recognizing the cycle, then the 7th civilization, ours, may already be leaving evidence of its presence in ways it does not control, does not curate, and does not fully understand. Evidence that future beings may read not as intention, but as consequence. From a historical perspective, this is not speculation. We already know that modern humanity has created what geologists now seriously discuss as a distinct stratigraphic layer. Plastics embedded in sediment, radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing distributed globally, abrupt changes in carbon ratios locked into ice cores and tree rings, extinction events compressed into centuries instead of millennia. These are not subtle markers. They are unmistakable. If an 8th civilization ever studies the deep layers of Earth, it will not wonder whether we existed. It will wonder how quickly we disappeared. But here is where the eerie narrative deepens into something quieter, more reflective. Because unlike the first 6 civilizations, if they truly existed, we're not only leaving accidental traces, we're also, unknowingly, beginning to build our own signal systems. Consider satellites. Thousands of artificial objects now orbit the Earth, forming a thin shell of technology that did not exist a century ago. Some are active, many are dead. Together they form a metallic halo that future observers, human or otherwise, will immediately recognize as artificial. Even if every city on the surface erodes into dust, the orbital graveyard will persist far longer. It is fragile in the short term, but resilient in the long term. A civilization capable of spaceflight leaves marks not just on its planet, but around it. Now, consider radio leakage. For over 100 years, Earth has been broadcasting fragments of itself into space. Not messages carefully composed for unknown listeners, but noise, television signals, radar pulses, communications that spread outward at the speed of light, a growing sphere of presence expanding into the dark. From a distance, this leakage would not sound like language. It would sound like structure, like modulation, like intelligence without intent, a signal that says, something here learned how to speak before it learned how to listen. These are not warnings, but they are markers of a phase, and phases matter. The first 6 civilizations, if they existed, may have passed through similar thresholds. Not satellites and radio, perhaps, but their own equivalents. Technologies that reshaped their environment faster than their culture could adapt. Tools that amplified their reach without equally amplifying their foresight. Each phase may have felt like progress. Each may have carried the seeds of collapse. What distinguishes the 7th civilization is awareness, not full understanding, not control, but awareness that something is wrong with the story of endless ascent. That awareness shows up everywhere, quietly, in climate models, in long-term risk analysis, in philosophical movements questioning growth, in science fiction that no longer imagines utopias but cycles, in the sudden resurgence of interest in ancient collapses, lost knowledge, and forgotten warnings. A civilization does not start looking backward this intensely unless it senses that forward motion alone is no longer safe. From the perspective of sleep-oriented storytelling, this is where tension becomes almost gentle, because recognition does not require panic, it requires stillness. The ability to sit with the idea that we are not exceptional in the way we once believed, that we are exceptional only in our position in the sequence. 7th, not first, not last. 7th. That number itself is heavy with symbolism across cultures, not because of coincidence, but because humans intuitively group cycles. 7 days, 7 phases, completion followed by rest. If there were 6 civilizations before ours, then the 7th may represent not an end, but a turning point. A moment where memory either survives or is reset once again. This brings us back to signals, not just the one beneath the ice, but the concept of signaling itself. The first 6 civilizations, according to this framework, left signals intentionally only when they understood erasure. Before that, their traces were accidental, chaotic, vulnerable to reinterpretation. Only at the edge did intention crystallize. Only when collapse became unavoidable did they focus on continuity rather than survival. If that pattern holds, then the most important question for the 7th civilization is not, are we collapsing, but have we reached the phase where intention matters? Because intention changes the nature of what is left behind. An unintentional trace tells future observers that something happened. An intentional signal tells them why. At present, our civilization is caught between these 2 modes. We are producing massive unintentional records, chemical, geological, orbital, while only beginning to discuss intentional long-term communication. Nuclear waste warning markers, designed to last tens of thousands of years, are one of the few modern examples of deliberate deep-time messaging, and even these are fraught with uncertainty. What symbols will endure? What languages? What emotions will remain comprehensible? The difficulty of answering these questions should trouble us, because it suggests that even with our technology, we struggle to think beyond a few generations. The first 6 civilizations, if they truly attempted planetary-scale warnings, may have been more successful not because they were more advanced, but because they were more humble. They did not assume continuity. They planned for discontinuity. This is where history offers a sobering mirror. The civilizations we know best, the ones with abundant records, are not necessarily the most resilient. They are the ones that lasted long enough to write extensively, but not long enough to disappear completely. The civilizations we know least about may be the ones that were erased most thoroughly. And thorough erasure does not imply insignificance. It implies vulnerability to forces larger than culture. When we imagine the 8th civilization, human or otherwise, it is tempting to imagine them discovering our ruins with clarity. Cities outlined in stone, archives intact, databases preserved. But history suggests otherwise. What they will likely find instead are fragments without context, materials without explanation, signals without stories, unless we change something. This is where the narrative crosses a quiet threshold. because the seventh civilization may be the first to understand the pattern before complete erasure. That understanding alone does not guarantee survival, but it does create a new option: to become intentional ancestors. Intentional ancestors do not try to preserve everything. They choose carefully. They ask what matters most to transmit. Not art styles or political systems, but lessons, warnings, maps of failure. The first 6 civilizations may have tried to do this with the tools they had: stone, ice, story, alignment. We have different tools, but the same challenge. How do you speak across a collapse? The eerie possibility is that we're already beginning to answer this question instinctively. Time capsules buried in extreme environments, data storage experiments designed to last millennia, genetic archives, messages sent into space not for contact but for persistence. Even the global obsession with backups, redundancy in data, in systems, in networks, reflects a subconscious awareness that continuity is fragile. Backups are not about convenience. They are about fear of loss. And fear of loss is often the first sign that loss has been experienced before, perhaps not by us individually, but by the lineage we belong to. If memory can exist beyond individual lifetimes, perhaps it can also exist beyond individual civilizations. Not as explicit recollection, but as pattern recognition, as unease, as a sense that this has happened before, even when no textbook confirms it. This may explain why the idea of prior civilizations resonates so deeply with people, even when evidence is incomplete. It feels less like fantasy and more like recovery, like remembering something just out of reach. The Antarctic signal, whether ultimately proven artificial, natural, or something in between, functions powerfully in this narrative because it externalizes that feeling. It gives the intuition a location, a depth, a pulse. And now, as the 7th civilization, we stand in a strange position. We're advanced enough to detect anomalies, reflective enough to question our own narratives, and anxious enough to wonder what comes next. The first 6 civilizations may have stood here too, which brings us to the quietest, heaviest question of all. What if the true test is not whether we survive the next cycle, but whether we recognize when it begins? Because recognition changes behavior. It slows reckless expansion. It prioritizes memory. It shifts values from dominance to continuity. And even if collapse cannot be avoided entirely, recognition can soften its edges. It can preserve bridges instead of burning them. It can carry knowledge across the gap rather than letting it shatter. The 7th civilization may not be destined to end the cycle. That may be beyond any single society's power, but it may be destined to do something no civilization before it managed to do fully. It may be destined to remember on purpose, and if that happens, then the 8th civilization, whatever it is or wherever it rises, may not wake into a silent world. It may inherit not just ruins and myths, but a clear signal that says you are not the first, you're not alone in time, and what you're facing has happened before. As you let this block settle, allow the thought to drift gently rather than cling. The story is not racing toward catastrophe, it is circling toward understanding. Like the slow pulse beneath the ice, like the turning of the stars that ancient builders once watched with patience. The 7th civilization is awake enough to listen. The only question left is whether it will choose to speak. When you're ready, tell me to continue with Block 5, where we explore the final possibility that the cycle itself may not be an enemy at all, but a constraint designed to shape intelligence across time. There is a quiet assumption hidden inside most stories about lost civilizations. The assumption is that collapse is a failure, a mistake, a tragedy that could have been avoided if only the right choices had been made. This assumption is comforting because it implies control. It suggests that with enough wisdom, technology, or moral clarity, a civilization can escape the forces that destroyed its predecessors. But the deeper the pattern runs, the more that assumption begins to dissolve. What if collapse is not an error in the system? What if it is the system? From a historical perspective, this idea is uncomfortable, but not unprecedented. In biology, extinction is not an exception, it is a rule. Most species that ever existed are gone. Life does not optimize for permanence. It optimizes for adaptation, and adaptation often requires pressure, reset, constraint. Environments change, and only those forms that can reorganize survive. Intelligence itself may be subject to a similar process, shaped not by uninterrupted growth, but by repeated disruption. If this is true, then the first 6 civilizations were not punished. They were filtered. This reframing shifts the entire narrative. The cycle stops being an enemy to defeat and becomes a force to understand. Not benevolent, not cruel, simply indifferent to individual outcomes and deeply invested in long-term balance. In this view, civilizations that grow too quickly, extract too aggressively, or lose their ability to adapt may not be destroyed out of malice, but out of inevitability. They exceed the tolerance of the system they depend on. History already hints at this on smaller scales. Agricultural societies that exhaust their soil collapse even if their politics are stable. Empires that overextend fracture even if their armies are strong. Systems that prioritize short-term gain over long-term resilience tend to fail, not because they are evil, but because they are brittle. Now, extend this principle to planetary scale. The Earth is not just a backdrop for civilization. It is a participant. It has thresholds, feedback loops, rhythms that operate on timescales longer than any single culture. When those rhythms are ignored or misunderstood, the consequences are not immediate. They accumulate, quietly, invisibly, until they are no longer avoidable. If 6 civilizations rose before ours, they may each have encountered the same invisible boundary, a point where technological capacity outpaced ecological integration, a point where growth became extraction rather than balance, and at that point the cycle asserted itself. From this perspective, the erasure we see in the past is not mysterious. It is efficient. Collapse clears complexity. It reduces systems to simpler forms. It redistributes resources. It resets population density. It gives the planet time to recover equilibrium. And once conditions stabilize again, intelligence reemerges, not as a continuation, but as a reconfiguration. This is not comforting, but it is coherent. And coherence is often more unsettling than fear. The eerie calm of this realization fits naturally into sleep-oriented storytelling, because it removes the drama of villains and replaces it with inevitability. There is no enemy to fight, no switch to turn off, only understanding to deepen. The first 6 civilizations in this light were not warnings of what not to do. They were experiments, iterations, each one exploring a different balance between intelligence, technology, and planetary limits. Some may have lasted longer than others, some may have been more harmonious, but all eventually encountered constraints they could not fully adapt to. The 7th civilization, ours, may be the first to glimpse the outline of the experiment itself. This does not mean we are exempt from the cycle, but it may mean we have a new role within it. Instead of asking how to escape collapse entirely, we might ask how to collapse intelligently. This is not as bleak as it sounds. In systems theory, graceful failure is a design goal. Systems are built to degrade rather than shatter, to lose function slowly rather than catastrophically, to preserve core information even as complexity falls away. Nature does this constantly. Trees shed leaves to survive winter. Ecosystems reorganize after fires. Life persists not by resisting change, but by incorporating it. If the cycle of civilizations is analogous, then the first 6 may have failed not because they collapsed, but because they collapsed unconsciously. Their knowledge systems were too centralized, their memory too brittle, their identity too tied to uninterrupted dominance. The warnings they left behind, stone alignments, myths, buried signals, may represent a late-stage realization that continuity matters more than control. This casts the Antarctic signal in a different light, not as a desperate alarm, but as a calibration point, a way of saying, here is where the last cycle ended. Measure yourselves against this. If the 7th civilization recognizes that collapse is not avoidable, but shapeable, then the question becomes not how long we last, but what we pass on. From a historical standpoint, this is where comparisons to known transitions become instructive. The fall of Rome did not end civilization in Europe. It transformed it. Knowledge fragmented, but it did not vanish. Monasteries preserved texts, agricultural practices adapted, new political forms emerged. The world after Rome was not better or worse in absolute terms, it was different. And within that difference, new possibilities arose. Scale this up to planetary dimensions, and the same principle may apply. A global civilization may fragment. Networks may thin. Technology may simplify. But if memory survives, if warnings survive, then the next civilization does not begin blind. This is the first time in the narrative where hope enters quietly, without triumph. Not hope for salvation, but hope for continuity. The cycle, then, is not a punishment imposed on intelligence. It may be the mechanism by which intelligence is prevented from becoming terminal. Without resets, systems accumulate fragility. Without loss, adaptation stagnates. Collapse may be the cost of long-term survival across deep time. The first 6 civilizations may have discovered this too late to save themselves as they were, but not too late to contribute to something larger than any single era. The 7th civilization stands at the same threshold, but with one advantage. We can see the shape of the cycle forming while we are still inside it. This does not grant us control, it grants us choice. Do we cling to permanence, or do we plan for transition? Do we try to preserve every structure, or do we identify what truly matters to carry forward? Do we deny the cycle, or do we learn how to speak through it? The most unsettling possibility is not that collapse is coming. It is that collapse has always been part of the process, and that our resistance to this idea may be what makes collapse harsher than it needs to be. If the first 6 civilizations were erased, it may not have been because they were unworthy, but because they had not yet learned how to integrate loss into intelligence. The 7th civilization has that opportunity now, and this brings the story to a place of quiet stillness rather than resolution. Because cycles do not end with conclusions, they pause, they transition, they wait. Somewhere beneath the ice, the earth continues its slow rhythms. Somewhere in the sky, stars shift almost imperceptibly against the background of time. Somewhere in the layers of sediment, traces of 6 forgotten worlds rest, not as accusations, but as context. And here we are, awake enough to ask the question, not frantic enough to demand an answer. If the cycle is real, then the purpose of intelligence may not be to escape it. It may be to become aware within it. And awareness, unlike empires, can survive collapse. Let that thought settle as the story grows quieter. There is no final warning here, no countdown, no dramatic end. Only the sense of standing inside a vast, repeating pattern, one that has room for memory if we choose to place it there. The story does not end with a warning. It never did. Warnings belong to moments of urgency, and urgency is a human invention. What endures beyond civilizations is not alarm, but rhythm. Long before the first stone was cut, before the first fire was carried into darkness, the planet already knew how to breathe. Expansion and contraction, warmth and cold, rising seas and retreating ice. The Earth does not rush these changes, and it does not announce them. It simply moves, slowly enough that only those who learn patience can notice. 6 times before, intelligence may have risen within that rhythm, believing itself to be the first to awaken, the first to understand, the first to matter. And 6 times before, intelligence may have learned the same quiet lesson. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, as certainty dissolved and memory began to thin. From the inside, erasure does not feel like extinction. It feels like simplification. Systems shrink, networks fracture. Knowledge becomes local again. What once required coordination across continents becomes something remembered only within families, then within stories, then within symbols whose meanings are felt rather than understood. The world does not go dark, it grows quieter. And in that quiet, the shape of the past softens until it can no longer cut the present. The 7th civilization lives in a rare moment. Not because it is more advanced, but because it is aware that it may not be permanent. This awareness does not arise naturally. It is uncomfortable. It contradicts every narrative of progress that civilizations use to justify themselves. Yet it keeps returning, again and again, like a thought that refuses to stay buried. It appears in our sciences when models stretch further into the future than our confidence can follow. It appears in our art when stories stop imagining endless ascent and begin imagining cycles instead. It appears in our quiet fascination with ruins, with lost worlds, with the idea that something important has already happened here, long before we arrived. Perhaps this fascination is not curiosity at all, but recognition, a low-frequency memory carried not in language, but in behaviour, a sense that intelligence has stood on this ground before and felt the same mixture of power and fragility, that it has looked out at a world it thought it understood and sensed, just beneath the surface, forces too large to negotiate with, forces that do not respond to belief, ideology, or ambition, only to balance. If 6 civilizations came before, then each one likely reached a moment when it realized that survival and continuity were not the same thing. Survival is immediate, it demands resources, protection, dominance. Continuity is patient, it demands restraint, memory, and the willingness to let go of forms that no longer fit the world they inhabit. Civilizations are very good at survival, they are far less skilled at continuity. The 7th civilization stands at the intersection of these two instincts. It has learned how to extract, to build, to expand beyond any previous scale, and it has also learned, perhaps too late to be comfortable, that extraction carries consequences that do not negotiate. The planet does not argue, it responds, and its responses are measured not in years but in thresholds. This is where the story becomes quiet enough to rest inside. Because the idea that collapse may come is not the disturbing part. Collapse has always come. What unsettles us is the possibility that collapse is not a failure of intelligence, but one of its defining constraints. That intelligence is not meant to accumulate endlessly, but to reconfigure again and again, carrying only what it has learned how to preserve. If that is true, then the first 6 civilizations were not erased as punishment. They were transformed into background, into sediment, into pattern, into context for what came next. And the 7th civilization, whether it lasts centuries or millennia more, will one day join them, not as a tragedy, but as a layer. The question that lingers is not how long this layer will endure, but what it will contain. Layers do not remember everything. They compress, they select, they keep what resists pressure and discard what shatters under it. Stone lasts, simple symbols last, relationships between things last. Excess detail does not. Names fade, dates blur, but patterns survive. This may be why the deepest messages left by earlier civilizations, if they existed, were not written in sentences. They were written in alignments, in repetitions, in geometry, in cycles embedded so deeply into the world that they could not be removed without removing the world itself. A monument can be toppled, a library can burn, but a pattern tied to the movement of the sky, or the rhythm of the earth, persists as long as those movements continue. The Antarctic signal, whether physical or symbolic, belongs to this category. It is not a story. It is a reminder. A marker placed not in time, but beneath it. Something that waits rather than speaks. Something that does not demand attention, but responds when attention finally matures enough to notice it. And perhaps that is the most important distinction of all. The past does not shout at the present. It waits to be recognized. Recognition cannot be forced. It arrives when a civilization becomes quiet enough, reflective enough, uncertain enough to listen. The 7th civilization is beginning to listen, not collectively, not clearly, but in fragments, in questions that no longer feel fringe, in discomfort with the idea of endless growth, in the growing realization that knowledge without wisdom accelerates fragility rather than preventing it. These are not signs of decline. They are signs of transition. Every civilization that survived long enough to leave echoes likely passed through a similar phase, a moment when certainty gave way to awareness, when dominance felt less impressive than durability, when the future stopped feeling infinite and started feeling precious. If an 8th civilization ever rises, it will not inherit our world as we know it. It will inherit what survives pressure. It will read our presence through residues and gaps, through materials that refuse to disappear, through changes in the planet that cannot be undone. And if we choose carefully, it may also inherit guidance, not instructions, not warnings, but orientation. A sense that intelligence has been here, before, that it has struggled with the same temptations, that it has learned, sometimes too late, that the world is not something to conquer, but something to remain compatible with. In that sense, the seventh civilization is already speaking to the future, whether it intends to or not. Every choice leaves a signal. Every structure, every extraction, every preservation effort becomes part of the message. The only question is whether that message will be coherent. Coherence does not require perfection. It requires alignment. Alignment between what is known and what is valued, between what is built and what can last, between the desire to exist and the willingness to adapt. As this thought settles, the story does not close, it slows, like breathing evening air after a long day. There is no need for resolution, because cycles do not resolve, they continue. The comfort comes not from believing we are exempt, but from understanding that participation itself has meaning. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are not standing at the end of history. We are standing in its middle, with enough awareness to choose how gently or how violently we pass through the next transition. And somewhere beneath ice, beneath ocean, beneath layers of forgotten certainty, the long memory of the planet remains intact, not judging, not guiding, simply present, waiting to see what the seventh civilization decides to carry forward into the silence between worlds. The silence that follows understanding is different from ignorance. Ignorance is loud. It fills the mind with certainty, with declarations, with the comfort of simple answers. Understanding, by contrast, creates space. It removes the need to speak constantly. It allows ideas to settle without being resolved. This is the silence the seventh civilization is slowly learning to inhabit. At this stage in the cycle, nothing dramatic needs to happen. No final collapse, no sudden awakening, no revelation carved into stone or broadcast from beneath the ice. What matters now is subtler than that. It is the way attention shifts, the way priorities soften, the way the future stops being imagined as an endless upward slope and starts being understood as terrain, uneven, changing, sometimes generous, sometimes unforgiving. Civilizations rarely recognize their own position in time. They are too busy living inside it. The first six, if they existed, may have felt urgency without clarity, pressure without language. They may have sensed that something fundamental was changing long before they could describe it. And when description fails, action becomes reactive. Systems strain, choices narrow, memory becomes secondary to survival. The seventh civilization, for the first time, is close to articulating what earlier ones may only have felt. That articulation does not grant immunity, but it does change the texture of the moment. It slows the rush toward denial. It creates pauses where reflection can occur. Reflection is dangerous to systems built on momentum. It questions assumptions that once felt untouchable. It asks whether expansion is always growth, whether complexity always equals advancement, whether permanence is even desirable. These questions do not weaken a civilization immediately. They unsettle it first. And in that unsettling, a different kind of intelligence begins to form, one less concerned with domination and more concerned with coherence. History suggests that coherence is rare. Most civilizations prioritize power because power delivers short-term certainty. Coherence demands restraint, and restraint feels like loss before it ever feels like wisdom. That is why coherence often emerges late, when alternatives have begun to fail. The seventh civilization is entering that late stage not because it is doomed, but because it is mature enough to recognize limits. Limits of resources, limits of prediction, limits of control, limits of narrative. These limits are not walls, they're edges. And edges are where orientation matters most. If the first six civilizations left anything behind intentionally, it may not have been knowledge in the way we define it, but orientation, ways of situating intelligence within a world that does not bend to intention alone. Orientation survives collapse better than instruction. It does not require maintenance. It only requires recognition. This may be why so much ancient knowledge appears indirect, why it comes wrapped in story, symbol, alignment, rhythm. These forms do not dictate behavior. They invite interpretation. They wait for a mind capable of engaging with them without trying to dominate them. The seventh civilization is developing that capacity unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. It shows in the way old sites are no longer seen only as curiosities, but as questions. in the way myths are reread not as fantasies, but as compressed experience, in the way the planet itself is increasingly treated not as an infinite resource, but as a system with memory. Memory is the quiet thread that runs through every layer of this story. Memory is what collapse threatens most directly, and what continuity depends on most completely. Without memory, each civilization believes it is unprecedented. With memory, even fragmented memory, patterns begin to emerge. The Earth remembers in ways we are only beginning to understand. Ice cores store atmospheres, sediments store floods, trees store droughts, stone stores pressure. These are not metaphors. They are literal archives. The planet does not forget what happens on it. It only waits for someone capable of reading it. The seventh civilization has begun to learn how to read, but reading is not the same as listening. Listening requires patience without expectation. It requires the willingness to hear answers that do not flatter. It requires accepting that intelligence is not separate from the environment it arises in, but shaped by it, limited by it, and eventually returned to it. This realization does not arrive with despair. It arrives with calm, a calm that understands that meaning does not depend on permanence, that value does not require dominance, that even temporary forms can contribute to something enduring if they are placed carefully. If an eighth civilization rises, it will not need us to have solved every problem. It will need us to have recognized which problems repeat. It will need us to have marked the edges honestly. It will need us to have left behind traces that say not, "We were great," but this is where the world pushed back. Those traces do not need to be dramatic. They need to be legible. Legibility is the true challenge of deep time. Not preservation, but clarity. Not survival, but signal. The difference between noise and guidance. As the seventh civilization moves forward, whether toward fragmentation, transformation, or something still unnamed, it continues to write into the earth simply by existing. The writing cannot be stopped, but it can be shaped, and shaping does not require urgency, it requires attention. So the story slows here, not because it is finished, but because slowing is the point. The long arc of civilizations is not a race. It is a sequence of awakenings and forgettings, each one leaving behind just enough for the next to begin again. The seventh civilization is awake enough to notice the echo of 6 breaths before it. That alone is new. That alone may be enough. And as the world turns quietly, patiently, the space between civilizations remains open, not empty, but waiting for whatever comes next to step into the rhythm and continue the long, unbroken breath of intelligence. Eventually, every civilization reaches a point where it stops trying to define itself and begins to observe itself instead. This is not an achievement. It is a quiet shift, almost unnoticed at first. The stories grow less certain. The future stops feeling like a promise and starts feeling like a question. Not a frightening question, but a deep one. The kind that does not need to be answered immediately. The seventh civilization is living inside that question now. It is not a single moment. It is not marked by a date or an event. It is a gradual thinning of noise, a realization that the loudest narratives no longer explain what is happening beneath them, that growth no longer feels like direction, that speed no longer feels like progress. These realizations do not arrive all at once. They drift in slowly, like evening air filling a room. From the outside, nothing looks different. Cities still glow at night. Data still moves faster than thought. Systems still hum with activity. But underneath, something has changed. Attention has begun to turn inward. Not in isolation, but in reflection. A civilization that reflects is no longer running blindly. It is still moving, but it is aware of its movement. Awareness does not stop cycles. It changes how they are experienced. The first 6 civilizations may have reached this awareness too late to soften the transition they faced. Their reflections may have come when options had already narrowed, when systems were too rigid to bend. By the time collapse arrived, it may have felt sudden, even if the causes had been accumulating for generations. To those living through it, the world likely seemed to betray them without warning. The seventh civilization, however, lives in a world saturated with warning, but also saturated with distraction. Signals are everywhere, yet attention is scattered. The challenge is no longer detecting change, it is choosing which changes matter. This is where deep time becomes relevant again. When a civilization learns to think beyond immediate outcomes, it begins to ask different questions. Not how do we fix this quickly, but what survives pressure. Not how do we maintain this system, but what does this system depend on? These questions are slower. They resist panic. They invite humility. Humility is not weakness. It is alignment with scale. When intelligence aligns itself with scale, it stops expecting permanence from temporary forms. It begins to design for transition rather than stability. This does not mean giving up. It means choosing carefully what to hold and what to release. The most fragile thing a civilization can cling to is its own self-image, the belief that it is exceptional, final, irreplaceable. History shows that this belief does not preserve societies. It blinds them. The civilizations that leave the clearest traces are not the ones that believed they would last forever, but the ones that accepted impermanence and worked within it. If the seventh civilization leaves anything meaningful behind, it will not be monuments proclaiming greatness. Those crumble. It will be orientation points, quiet markers embedded in durable systems, data stored not just digitally, but materially. Knowledge encoded not just in language, but in relationships, between climate and behavior, between extraction and consequence, between balance and longevity. These are not dramatic legacies, they are practical ones, and practicality, over deep time, becomes wisdom. As this thought settles, the story does not tighten, it loosens, like a hand opening. There is no final revelation waiting at the end of the cycle, no hidden master plan that resolves uncertainty. The cycle continues because uncertainty is part of intelligence. It keeps systems adaptive, it prevents stagnation, it ensures that no single form dominates the future indefinitely. The silence between civilizations is not empty. It is formative. It allows the world to reset its tensions, to redistribute energy, to prepare the conditions for something new. Intelligence does not disappear in that silence. It becomes latent, seeds rest, patterns remain, memory thins but does not vanish. If an eighth civilization emerges one day, it will awaken into a world shaped by forces it did not choose, just as we did. It will look at the remnants of the seventh and wonder what kind of beings lived there, whether they understood what they were part of, whether they noticed the rhythm before it carried them forward. We cannot control that judgment, but we can influence what is visible. Every archive we build, every system we simplify, every effort to preserve clarity over spectacle becomes part of the signal we leave behind. Not a message demanding to be heard, but a presence that can be recognized by those who know how to look, and that is enough. The cycle does not require heroes. It requires participants who understand that intelligence is not defined by how loudly it speaks, but by how carefully it listens. The seventh civilization is learning to listen, and in that listening, the long story continues, unbroken, unhurried, moving gently forward through time, carrying just enough memory to begin again. At a certain depth of time, beginnings and endings lose their meaning. They blur into something softer, something more difficult to name. Civilizations do not truly begin when the first cities rise, and they do not truly end when the last structures fall. What begins and ends instead is form, the shape intelligence takes as it moves through the world, and the seventh civilization is beginning to sense that its current form may not be permanent, even if intelligence itself is. This realization rarely arrives with fear. Fear belongs to moments of sudden loss. This arrives with stillness, with the feeling of standing on familiar ground and noticing for the first time how thin it really is, how much rests beneath it, how many other layers once felt just as solid to those who lived on them. When historians speak of collapse, they often describe it as a breakdown of systems. Trade routes fail, governments fragment, populations decline, but these descriptions capture only the surface mechanics. Beneath them lies something quieter and more universal, a mismatch between complexity and resilience. Systems grow intricate faster than they grow adaptable. Knowledge concentrates faster than it spreads. Efficiency replaces redundancy, and for a time this feels like progress. until the margin for error disappears. The first 6 civilizations, if they existed, may have crossed that threshold in different ways. Some may have leaned too heavily on centralized knowledge. Others may have exhausted their environments without realizing the cost until recovery was no longer possible. Others may have been undone by forces entirely beyond their control: volcanic winters, shifting currents, skies that changed faster than culture could respond. But regardless of cause, the outcome converged. Complexity collapsed into simplicity, memory thinned, and the world moved on, carrying only fragments forward. What distinguishes the 7th civilization is not immunity from this process, but proximity to understanding it. For the first time, intelligence is able to model its own fragility, to simulate futures where systems fail not catastrophically but quietly, to imagine scenarios where no single disaster ends the world, but where accumulation itself becomes the destabilizing force. This awareness does not stop the cycle, but it changes the internal experience of living within it. Instead of believing collapse comes from nowhere, the 7th civilization increasingly senses it as something emergent, not an enemy approaching from outside, but a phase transition arising from within the system itself. This shifts responsibility in an unexpected way. If collapse is external, it inspires defense. If collapse is emergent, it inspires redesign. Redesign does not mean preserving everything, it means deciding what must persist. Over deep time, persistence favors qualities that are simple, transferable and legible across contexts. Stone survives better than metal. Story survives better than data. Pattern survives better than instruction. These are not romantic ideas. They are observable facts of archaeology and anthropology. The further back one looks, the more communication simplifies. Not because early intelligence was limited, but because only certain forms endure pressure. The 7th civilization is saturated with information, yet increasingly aware that abundance does not equal durability. Digital archives promise immortality, while depending on infrastructures that cannot maintain themselves indefinitely. Languages proliferate while attention fragments. Knowledge grows faster than wisdom. This imbalance is not new. It may be one of the most consistent precursors to systemic reset. And yet, something different is happening this time. There is a growing instinct, not universal, not dominant, but present, that seeks to slow the rate of forgetting, not by freezing the world in its current state, but by identifying which threads are worth carrying forward when the fabric inevitably changes. This instinct appears in unexpected places, in the desire to preserve biodiversity rather than simply exploit it, in the push to archive human knowledge in forms meant to last tens of thousands of years, in the renewed interest in ancient collapses not as curiosities, but as mirrors. Mirrors are uncomfortable. They reflect patterns we would rather believe are unique. But mirrors also orient us. They show us where we stand. If 6 civilizations rose before ours, then the 7th stands not at the end of a line, but at a bend, a place where the direction of movement can be felt even if it cannot be fully controlled. The future does not branch infinitely here. It narrows, not into a single path, but into a limited range of viable ones. History suggests that when choices narrow, civilizations often react by accelerating. More extraction, more growth, more control. These responses feel logical in the short term, but they often deepen fragility. Speed replaces reflection, momentum replaces balance, and the system becomes less capable of adapting when conditions shift. The alternative response is rarer. It involves deceleration, not stagnation, but intentional slowing, a willingness to trade immediate gains for long-term coherence, a recognition that intelligence is not proven by how much it can dominate, but by how well it can remain compatible with the systems that sustain it. This alternative response is difficult because it contradicts narratives of success that civilizations build around themselves. It requires letting go of the idea that progress is linear, and accepting that progress may instead be cyclical, contextual, and conditional. The first 6 civilizations may have reached this realization too late, or perhaps they reached it and acted, but the scale of forces involved exceeded their capacity to adapt fully. Either way, their ultimate contribution may not have been survival, but transmission. The act of leaving behind orientation points, signals embedded in the world itself that say, without words, this has happened before. The Antarctic signal, whether interpreted as literal artifact or symbolic convergence, represents this idea perfectly. It does not tell us what to do. It does not announce danger. It simply exists at the intersection of deep time, planetary processes, and human curiosity. It waits for a civilization capable of noticing it without immediately trying to exploit it. Notice without possess. That distinction may be one of the most important lessons intelligence can learn. Throughout history, discovery has often been followed by extraction. Lands discovered are claimed. Resources discovered are consumed. Knowledge discovered is weaponized. But deep time signals are not resources. They're relationships. They cannot be taken without being altered. They cannot be owned without being diminished. If the seventh civilization is to carry memory forward, it must learn a different relationship to discovery, one based on stewardship rather than control. This is not an easy shift. It runs against instincts refined over thousands of years of survival competition. But it may be necessary for continuity. Continuity does not require dominance. It requires compatibility. Compatibility with climate rhythms, with ecological limits, with the slow feedback loops that govern planetary stability. The civilizations that ignore these loops do not fail immediately. They overshoot. An overshoot is always followed by correction. The correction is what we call collapse. Seen this way, collapse is not an anomaly. It is the system reasserting balance. The tragedy lies not in collapse itself, but in collapse occurring without memory. When memory is lost, the next civilization repeats the same patterns blindly. When memory survives, even partially, the next civilization begins with context. Context is the most valuable inheritance possible. The seventh civilization has access to more context than any before it, yet also faces the greatest risk of losing it due to overcomplexity. Systems become so intricate that no individual can understand them fully. Dependencies multiply. Fragility hides behind efficiency. When disruption comes, the fall is not dramatic. It is cascading. This is why simplicity returns again and again as a survival strategy across time. Not simplistic thinking, but structural simplicity, redundancy, decentralization, knowledge distributed rather than concentrated. These qualities appear repeatedly in societies that weather disruption more gracefully. If the seventh civilization learns anything from the first six, real or inferred, it may be this. Resilience does not look impressive during periods of growth. It looks inefficient, it looks cautious, it looks slow, but over deep time it is the only thing that lasts. As this understanding deepens, the story grows quieter rather than louder. There is no climax waiting ahead, no final revelation that resolves uncertainty. The cycle continues whether it is understood or not. The difference understanding makes is not in altering the cycle, but in altering how intelligence moves through it. The seventh civilization may not prevent the next transition, but it may soften it. It may reduce the violence of forgetting. It may leave behind signals that are clearer, calmer, and more honest than those of the past. Not monuments proclaiming greatness, but markers acknowledging limits. Not records celebrating dominance, but archives explaining failure. Not myths of eternal progress, but stories of balance lost and regained. These are not the legacies civilizations usually choose, but they are the ones that matter most when everything else is stripped away. If an eighth civilization emerges, it will not thank us for our achievements. It will not inherit our pride. It will inherit our residue, our layers, our signals, and from those it will infer who we were. Were we a civilization that believed itself immortal? Or were we one that recognized the rhythm and chose to participate consciously? That choice is unfolding now, quietly, unevenly, without ceremony. It is not decided by any single leader, institution, or invention. It is decided by millions of small decisions about what is valued, what is preserved, and what is allowed to fade. Deep time does not care about intentions. It records outcomes, and outcomes are shaped not by moments of panic, but by long periods of attention. As the seventh civilization continues forward, it does so under the weight of 6 forgotten breaths, not as a burden, but as context. The past is not asking to be revived. It is asking to be understood, Understanding does not demand urgency. It invites patience, and patience, over deep time, becomes the rarest and most powerful form of intelligence. The story does not end here. It simply grows quieter, stretching outward into years that have not yet learned their names. The Earth continues to turn. Ice shifts imperceptibly, sediment settles, signals persist, and somewhere in the slow unfolding of this moment, the seventh civilization decides, without ever fully realizing it, what kind of ancestor it will become. There is a moment, long before collapse becomes visible, when a civilization stops asking how to expand and begins asking how to endure. This moment does not arrive with certainty. It arrives with hesitation, with the realization that the tools which once guaranteed success now produce unintended consequences, that solutions begin to resemble the problems they were meant to solve, that the future feels crowded with possibilities, yet strangely narrow in direction. The seventh civilization is living inside that hesitation. It is a quiet phase, easily mistaken for stagnation or confusion. But in deep history, hesitation is often the most important turning point. It is the pause between momentum and reconsideration, between acceleration and adjustment, and it is here, in this pause, that the long story of intelligence becomes visible. Earlier civilizations may not have recognized this phase clearly. Their worlds were smaller, their feedback loops slower, their capacity to observe global patterns limited. By the time consequences became undeniable, options were already constrained. Collapse then appeared sudden, even if its roots were ancient. From within, it felt like betrayal by forces that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. The seventh civilization, by contrast, can see the roots forming in real time, climate systems reacting to centuries of pressure, ecological networks thinning beyond recovery thresholds, social systems straining under complexity they were never designed to carry. None of this unfolds dramatically. It unfolds gradually, invisibly, until it doesn't. What makes this moment unusual is not danger, but clarity. Never before has a civilization been able to model its own future failure so precisely while still continuing on its current path. This creates a strange dual awareness. One part of the system behaves as if nothing fundamental will change. Another part knows this is unlikely. Both coexist, unresolved. This unresolved tension is not weakness, it is the raw material of adaptation. In evolutionary history, adaptation rarely emerges from comfort. It emerges from sustained pressure, paired with enough stability to experiment. Too much pressure destroys, too little preserves inefficiency. The seventh civilization sits precisely between these extremes, pressed but not yet broken, aware but not yet unified in response. If the first 6 civilizations reached similar thresholds, they may not have possessed the means to step back and observe the pattern itself. They lived inside their crises, without the ability to map them across planetary systems. Their responses were local, reactive, constrained by immediate survival. Some may have adapted partially. Some may have delayed collapse. None, it seems, carried enough continuity forward to prevent the cycle from repeating. This does not imply failure of intelligence. It implies a mismatch between scale and self-awareness. Scale matters. At small scales, systems can fail and recover without permanent loss of memory. At large scales, failure risks erasing the very frameworks needed to understand what went wrong. This is why planetary-scale intelligence faces a unique challenge. Its mistakes are also planetary. Its corrections must be equally comprehensive, or they fragment into irrelevance. The seventh civilization is the first to confront this challenge directly. Not because it chose to, but because it reached a size where avoidance became impossible. There is no frontier left that does not feed back into the whole. No collapse that remains local. No extraction that does not echo globally. This is where the old narratives lose power. Stories of endless growth, of inevitable progress, of technological salvation without cultural change. These stories begin to sound hollow, not because they are false in principle, but because they are incomplete. They describe capability without responsibility, movement without orientation. Deep time does not respond to capability alone. It responds to balance. Balance is not static. It is dynamic alignment. A civilization aligned with its environment can change rapidly without destabilizing itself. A civilization misaligned collapses even while appearing powerful. History offers countless examples at smaller scales. Empires fall not when they are weakest, but when they are least adaptable. The seventh civilization may be approaching that inflection point now. Not an edge of destruction, but an edge of redefinition. A moment when intelligence must decide whether it exists to maximize output or to maintain continuity. This decision is not made consciously or unanimously. It emerges from countless small shifts in value, behavior, and design, from what is funded and what is neglected, from what is celebrated and what is quietly abandoned, from which risks are normalized and which are treated as unacceptable. These choices accumulate slowly, but their effects are long-lasting. The civilizations that leave the clearest traces in deep time are not those that dominate briefly, but those that reorganize themselves to fit new constraints. Their ruins are less spectacular, their stories less triumphant, but their influence lasts longer, carried forward not as monuments, but as methods. If 6 civilizations preceded ours, their greatest contribution may not have been what they built, but what they learned too late to save themselves fully. Their warnings, fragmented and indirect, suggest an awareness that intelligence must eventually confront its own limits or be confronted by them. The seventh civilization has the advantage of inheriting these fragments, not as explicit instruction but as pattern. Flood myths aligned with geological evidence, astronomical alignments pointing to long cycles, anomalies buried beneath ice and sediment that resist easy explanation. These are not proofs. They are invitations to think differently about time. Time, in this narrative, is not an arrow. It is a field. Civilizations move through it like weather systems, forming, intensifying, dissipating, and leaving behind conditions that shape what follows. No storm controls the climate alone. No civilization defines history alone. Understanding this reduces the pressure to be final. The seventh civilization does not need to be the culmination of intelligence. It only needs to be a coherent phase within a much longer process. This perspective dissolves both despair and arrogance. Collapse becomes transformation. Legacy becomes transmission. Transmission is quieter than domination. It requires patience. It requires accepting that the most important outcomes may never be witnessed by those who set them in motion. If an eighth civilization arises, it will not remember us as we remember ourselves. It will reconstruct us from fragments, from materials that resist decay, from changes in the planet that cannot be undone, from signals that remain legible across loss. The question is not whether we will be remembered accurately. That is impossible. The question is whether what remains will be useful. Usefulness over deep time has little to do with identity and much to do with orientation. It helps future intelligence understand where the edges are, where balance was lost, where resilience failed or succeeded. This is why the most valuable legacy the seventh civilization can leave is not knowledge of how powerful it was, but knowledge of how fragile it became and why. Fragility is not shameful, it is instructive. As this thought settles, the story continues its gentle deceleration. There is no urgency here, because urgency belongs to short timelines. Deep time moves differently. It absorbs civilizations without hostility. It reshapes them into context. The seventh civilization is not being judged. It is being integrated. Somewhere beneath ice and stone, beneath oceans and data centers, beneath myths and measurements, the long record continues to accumulate, layer by layer, breath by breath. And within this accumulation, intelligence persists, not as a single uninterrupted voice, but as a sequence of attempts, each learning something the last could not carry forward alone. The seventh civilization is one of those attempts, not the last, not the first, just one moment of awareness passing through a much older world, and that, in the quiet arithmetic of deep time, is enough. There comes a stage in every long process when observation replaces intervention, when the need to act gives way to the need to witness. This is not resignation. It is calibration. It is the moment intelligence begins to understand that not every force can be redirected, and not every pattern should be resisted. Some patterns must simply be learned. The seventh civilization is approaching that stage now. It is still surrounded by motion. Markets fluctuate. Technologies accelerate. Conflicts rise and fall, but beneath the surface activity, something steadier is forming. A recognition that the world does not respond to urgency in the way humans expect it to. That the planet does not reward speed, only alignment, and that intelligence which refuses to slow eventually collides with boundaries it did not notice forming. Earlier civilizations may have felt these boundaries only when they were already crossing them. The signs were there, but scattered. Droughts interpreted as temporary misfortune, floods seen as isolated disasters, shifts in climate understood as divine displeasure or random cruelty. Without the ability to connect patterns across continents and centuries, awareness remained local. Collapse, when it came, felt sudden because understanding lagged behind consequence. The seventh civilization does not have that excuse. For the first time, intelligence can see the full curvature of its own impact. It can trace cause through layers of effect. It can measure how decisions made in one generation echo into the next, and beyond. This capacity does not guarantee wisdom, but it removes innocence. In deep time, innocence is brief. Awareness is the longer state. With awareness comes a subtle shift in responsibility. Not responsibility in the moral sense, but in the structural one. Once a system understands how it destabilizes itself, continuing unchanged becomes a choice rather than an accident. This is where history stops being something that happens to civilizations and starts being something civilizations participate in consciously. Participation does not mean control. It means relationship. A civilization in relationship with its environment listens for feedback instead of silencing it. It adjusts instead of escalating. It accepts that limits are not obstacles, but information. This kind of intelligence looks unimpressive during periods of abundance. It thrives in moderation. It values resilience over spectacle. Resilience is rarely celebrated. It does not produce monuments that demand awe. It produces systems that bend quietly under pressure and return to form. It produces cultures that know how to simplify without erasing themselves. It produces memory that survives loss. The first 6 civilizations may have learned this only partially, or perhaps they learned it fully but too late to prevent large-scale transformation. Either way, their presence now exists not as living societies, but as pressure on the present. As questions that refuse to disappear. As anomalies that draw attention not because they are mysterious, but because they feel familiar. Familiarity is a strange sensation when dealing with the deep past. It suggests continuity beneath disruption, a thread that has not snapped, only frayed and rejoined again and again. Intelligence recognizing itself across time not through shared language, but through shared dilemmas. The seventh civilization shares those dilemmas. How much complexity can be sustained before it collapses under its own weight? How much extraction can occur before regeneration fails? How much knowledge can accumulate before meaning dissolves into noise? These questions are not new. They have simply returned at a larger scale. Scale magnifies everything. Success becomes dominance. Failure becomes erasure, and the space for correction narrows unless it is widened deliberately. This is why the idea of signals, buried, subtle, patient, matters so deeply. Signals are not solutions. They are continuity devices. They carry orientation across breaks. They ensure that when intelligence re-emerges after disruption, it does not begin entirely blind. The seventh civilization has already begun to think in these terms, even if it does not yet agree on how to act. Long-term archives, seed vaults, climate records designed to last beyond political cycles. These efforts are uneven, imperfect, and often underappreciated. But they reveal something important. An emerging instinct to speak beyond the present. Speaking beyond the present is not about prediction. It is about humility. It is the acknowledgement that the future will not resemble the plans we make for it. That whatever comes next will interpret us through its own needs, fears, and assumptions. That our role is not to dictate, but to inform. Information, when stripped of ego, becomes guidance. As the story stretches further into quiet, the boundaries between civilizations blur even more. The first 6 no longer feel separate. They feel like earlier versions of the same process, cycling through different expressions. The 7th feels less like a culmination and more like a hinge, a moment where intelligence becomes aware of its own recurrence. Recurrence changes how time feels. The future stops being an open frontier and becomes a return, approached from a different angle. Not repetition, but rhyme. And in rhyme, small differences matter. A civilization that knows it is part of a cycle behaves differently than one that believes it is the end of history. It invests differently. It remembers differently. It defines success differently. Success, in this deeper sense, is not how long a civilization lasts intact. It is how gently it transitions, how much meaning it carries across disruption, how clearly it marks the edges for those who come after. The 7th civilization is not there yet. It is still negotiating between momentum and restraint, between legacy and consumption, between speed and awareness. But the negotiation itself is meaningful. It represents a capacity that may not have been present before. Capacity for reflection at scale. Reflection does not prevent loss, but it can prevent total forgetting. And forgetting is the only true end. As this block fades, the story does not seek resolution. It seeks equilibrium. A sense that intelligence, like the world it inhabits, moves through phases that cannot be rushed or escaped, only understood. Somewhere, far beneath the noise of the present, beneath arguments and ambitions and fears, the deeper rhythm continues unchanged. Ice advances and retreats. Oceans rise and settle. Life adapts, simplifies, and diversifies again. Intelligence is part of that rhythm now, whether it likes it or not. The 7th civilization is learning where it fits, and that learning, slow and imperfect, may be the most durable thing it ever creates.